Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
So now we see the Arab contribution to science and philosophy. We have already seen the developments taking place in science during the Renaissance period, which is centric in Europe. But it is important to remember that there are several contributions which other sections of the people are making, which help the Europeans in the scientific inquiries and discoveries. So one such section is Arabic people, Arabians who are making a large contribution to the study of science and philosophy. So by the beginning of the 10th century, Arabs had made so much progress that they could make their own contribution to various sciences. So it is a time period before 4 centuries before the Renaissance, that is 10th century. So during this period, Arabs were in a very good state, and they were making much progress and contributing a lot to the study of various sciences too. By making researches in geometry, algebra, geography, astronomy, optics, chemistry, medicine, etc., they became leaders of the field of science. So before Europeans came into the forefront as making large discoveries, it was Arabians who were making efforts to know more about the universe and know the universal truths. And they were almost like the leaders of the science. And some of the best stocked libraries in the world and leading scientific laboratories were set up in the world during this period. So under the initiatives of the Arabian people, great libraries and laboratories were being set up in the period before 14th century, that is in and around 10th century, these developments are taking place. But it must be noted that many of the achievements of the Arabs in the field of science were done by the people outside Arabia, that is Khorasan, Egypt, Sudan. So the Arabians in other parts like Khorasan, Egypt and Sudan were the ones who were making such efforts. And the Arab science was truly international, and it had an international feature because of this. And it was called Arab science because Arabic was language of literature in their empire and the people. So this whole developments in science happening around 10th century is called Arab science because it was in the language of Arabic that this literature was getting produced. So the main cause of remarkable growth of Arab science and civilization was that intellectuals, scientists and scholars enjoyed personal freedom and the royal patronage. So at this time, royal patronage, that is, the kings were supporting such studies, and the scientists and the artists were free to study and observe and make new discoveries. All this helped the people indulge more and know more about the universe and its truths. After the 14th century, Arab science declined. So here comes an important development. By 14th century, when there is Renaissance in Europe and things are getting better, in the Arabic Empire or in the empire under the Arabians, what happens is the science and such developments decline or go down. And due to political developments affecting Arab Empire, and partly on account of growing orthodoxy is more, they are getting more religious and fundamental at this time, conservative, which hampered the growth of free thought. So till then, from 10th to 14th century, Arabians were taking interest in knowing more about the universe and searching for the truth. But by 14th century, such developments take a back seat and it declined because of the growing orthodoxy and the limitations on free thought. So this is what is happening in Arabic or Arab Empire, and these are the contributions because the discoveries which the Arabs gave shape to become a major contributing factor in Europe, because Europeans, when they take interest in knowing more about the universe, it is the Arab books and sources which play a major role in helping them know more about the universe and the scientific truths. So the question is, describe the contribution of Arabs to science. So you'll have to describe the 10th to 14th century, the developments taking place in Arabian Empire in this period, and in which ways it helps them know more about the scientific truths. Large libraries are set up and laboratories are also set up, and then they had a large support of the Arabic kings and the ruling class, who gave them funds and patronized them. And then finally by 14th century there is an effort to go back to orthodoxy, or there is a decline of these developments by the 14th century. So these are the developments which you will have to describe, and why it was called Arab science, because Arab was the language of literature in the empire and the people, and this scholars had enjoyed personal freedom and royal patronage, which helped them make very important discoveries. But sadly, by 14th century, all these developments declined. We now come to the next topic of the chapter, that is aspirations of women. So women is a section which we have till now missed out on. Because when we talk about the developments happening in the Renaissance period, we use the term man and rediscovery of man. So although man is a synonym of human beings, but it is men or the male figures who are playing a major role and who are in the forefront, taking benefit of all these changes. So what were the women doing then? Because it is the time period when women were not allowed to be free or to do things as they wished. So what is happening to women in this time period, and what is Renaissance doing to women? Is it helping women to rediscover themselves? Is it helping women to free themselves from the traditional bondages in which they were caught up in? So the new ideal of individuality and citizenship excluded women. So very sadly, when we talk about rediscovery of man in Renaissance, they are strictly holding it on to male figure or masculine identity. Women are excluded or not included in this new ideal of individuality and citizenship. Men from aristocratic families dominated public life and were the decision makers in their families. So, most powerful were the ones from aristocratic or elite or rich families. Elite means rich and upper class families. Dominated public life, and they were the decision makers who made decision on behalf of all other sections. They educated their sons to take their place in family businesses or in public life. So the sons of these families were encouraged to take up family business. And at times the younger sons were sent to the church. So one of the sons were encouraged to join the church as a clergy, and others were encouraged to take up the family business. Although their dowries were invested in family businesses, women generally had no say in how their husbands should run their business. Matrimonial alliances were made to strengthen business alliances. So sadly, the dowry of women was used in family business, but women had no say over how the business was to be run and what kind of investments their husband should invest in. So literally, women had no say over such things. And the matrimonial or marriage alliances were made to strengthen business alliance. So the economic factors were given more importance than anything else. The position of women in the families of merchants, however, was somewhat different. So although we talk about the category of women, it is well known that women belonging to the peasantry or the agricultural class will have different set of issues than the women who belong to the upper section. So here we see that families of merchants had women face different set of issues. And we see that shopkeepers were very often assisted by their wives in running shop. So shopkeepers were mostly assisted by the wives. And in families of merchants, that is traders and bankers, wives looked after the business when the male members were away on work. So male members were to go to far off places for the purpose of trade and other things. So it was women who looked after those responsibilities in the absence of men. The early death of a merchant compelled his widow to perform a large public role than was the case in aristocratic families. And in such exceptional incidents like the early death of one's husband, we could see that women take up the role of carrying out the business. But it was not something which was encouraged or which was usually seen. So we come to an important female figure in the Renaissance period, that is Cassandra Fedel. So in the field of literature, some women, however, did some creative work. They were sensitive about humanist education. So although women were excluded from individuality and citizenship and decision-making power, we could still see that there were some women who proved their talent and made contributions in the field of literature also. A women scholar, Cassandra Fedel, who lived between 1465 and 1558, was one of the few women who questioned the idea that women were incapable of achieving the qualities of a humanist thinker. So in the Renaissance period also, the popular belief was women were incapable of thinking and being rational. It was not the characteristic feature of a woman. But Cassandra Fedel questioned this notion in her works. She was well known for her proficiency in Greek and Latin. So she made efforts to learn these classical languages, Greek and Latin. She was invited to deliver lectures at the University of Padua. So one of the universities established in Italy, she was invited there during the Renaissance period to give lectures too. And Fedel was one of the many Venetian writers, so she was from the city of Venice, who criticized the Republic for creating a highly limited definition of freedom that favored the desires of men over those of women. So she strongly criticized such an idea of republic, that is, power of people. Republic means that all the power belongs to the people. But in this section of people, very sadly, they didn't include women. It was always the aristocratic and rich class who represented the section of people. And that too, only male or men were allowed to represent them. So another woman is Marquesa of Mantua, who was another remarkable woman scholar who ruled the state while her husband was absent. So she proved her potentials by ruling the state while her husband was absent. The court of Mantua was famous for its intellectual business. So she also took interest in intellectual activities and carried out all her responsibilities in very fine ways. The writings of women scholars revealed their conviction that they should have economic power, property, and education to show their worth in a world dominated by men. This is very important. Although people say that women are incapable of taking effective decisions and being rational, you must remember that they should be given equal opportunities. They should not be denied economic power and property and education. And if women are given all this, they can prove themselves. It is because women are denied these resources that it becomes difficult for women to prove themselves in a world which is dominated by men. And these important scholars like Fedel and Marchesa of Mantua, through their life, proved this right. So, question on this topic is, what was the position of women in Europe during the 15th to 16th centuries? So here you will have to say how this exclusion of women from citizenship and individuality happens in the Renaissance period, and the discovery of man gets limited to aristocratic. Discovery of man is very limited because it is limited to those men in the aristocratic family. And then you can give examples of exemplary women who contributed in the field of literature and intellectual activities, like Cassandra Fedel and Marquesa Mantua, their contributions, and in which ways they critique this exclusionary practice of the period of Renaissance. Now we come to another important development happening in the Renaissance period, that is conflict within the Christian church. We already saw how church is getting critiqued, how the scholars are raising doubts about the authority of the church and questioning the practices which control human minds. So now we see there are conflicts within the church also taking place in the Renaissance period. That is, in the realm of religion, Renaissance acted as a disruptive force, disruptive, that is dividing or dividing force, or a disruption happening in church during this time, when the movement spread from Italy to other European countries in the 15th and the 16th century. So these developments majorly take place in the 16th century. Many scholars in the universities in the North Europe were attracted by the humanist ideas. We have already seen in all parts of Europe a large number of scholars were influenced by the humanist ideas. Like the Italian scholars, they too focused on classical Greek and Roman texts and also on holy books of Christians. So they started rereading all the sacred books to know more about what was really written in the Bible. And in North Europe, humanism attracted members of the Christian church. They enjoined upon Christians to discard unnecessary rituals. So in North Europe, which includes England, Ireland, and Scotland, those regions, we see that humanism encouraged common people to discard or to do away with all those unnecessary rituals which made no real sense, which was only there to authorize the church to control human minds. And the Christian humanists like Thomas More in England, Erasmus in Holland, said that church, instead of being a thing of heart, had become a matter of ceremonies. So they criticized the church for hanging on to all unnecessary rituals and ceremonies. Instead of a matter of faith and matter of heart, it was just empty rhetoric or emptiness, or there was no meaning in it. It had all the unnecessary and useless rituals and ceremonies being followed by the church. The spiritual life of the church had sunk to a low ebb. So the spiritual life which church was originally supposed to take care was not given any kind of importance. Popes had become notorious for their loose and luxurious life and were incredibly corrupt. This was the worst problem. The popes, who were the head of the church by the medieval period, turned very corrupt. They enjoy all kind of luxuries and they just think about their self-interest and they're self-obsessed. This became a major problem which led to the decline of the spiritual arena of church. And in 1517, Martin Luther, a monk and a university lecturer at Wittenberg, launched his attack on the sale of indulgences, which was to provoke Reformation. He argued that people did not need priests to establish contacts with God. So for the first time, Martin Luther in 1517 declares that human beings have the capacity to know what God wants from them. And priests need not have to work as an intermediary between God and man, because man, through his knowledge of Bible and with his efforts to know more about God, can go back to the Holy Word, that is Holy Bible, and can try to understand what God really wants from him. So this priest or the clergy as an intermediary was a corrupt section who were trying to exploit this ignorance of man. So the sale of indulgences is when a man sins, and in order to ask pardon or forgiveness from God, he contributes a large amount of money to the church, and the priest then makes that man believe that because he has contributed financially to the church, that his sins will now be forgiven. So all these practices in some way was helping the church and the greedy priests take more profit or to have more profit at the cost of spirituality and faith. So for the first time, Martin Luther in 1517 declares that you don't need this priestly class to reach God. Instead, man is capable of doing it by himself. And this movement, called the Protestant Revolution, spread in almost half of the countries in Europe. The churches in Germany and Switzerland broke their connections with Pope and the Catholic Church. So as a result of this new revelation or this declaration of Martin Luther, we see very soon churches in England, Germany and Switzerland cut their connections with the Holy Catholic Church. And this whole movement, under the initiative of Martin Luther, came to be called the Protestant Revolution. So these are the developments majorly happening in Germany. And then when we come to Switzerland, we see Calvin organized the church and carried forward the ideas which was popularized by Martin Luther. So the participation of the people in the governance of their churches gave Calvinism unity and strength. So Calvin also said that members of the church should be given a say or should have power to express their opinions as far as the matters of the church were concerned. The teachings of Calvin penetrated silently into France. So from Switzerland, these teachings spread to parts of France. And groups of preachers of new religion moved about the country and established new churches. So members of the Church of Calvin moved to different parts of Europe and established new churches which cut off all the relations it had with the Catholic Church. And then there is this another section, that is the Protestants of France, who were called Huguenots. And in England, the church abuses and royal envy of Pope's powers encouraged humanism. Similar to the conditions in Germany, Switzerland and France, in England too, it was the church abuses and the corruption of popes which led to the coming of humanism in England. And Wycliffism and Lutheranism had prepared the ground for decisive break with Rome. So like Luther, there was another scholar, Wycliffe. He also criticized the church for these wrong measures and the corruption, and it helped the people have a decisive break with Rome by the 16th century. But the beginning of Reformation in England was chiefly the result of a quarrel between Henry VIII and Pope. He took very drastic steps to break with the Roman Catholic Church. Unlike in other parts of Europe, in England, the catalyst or the prime reason for the break of the the King of England with the Pope was a personal reason, and it resulted in a quarrel between or a fight between the King Henry VIII and Pope by the 16th century, and it led to the break of the relationship between King of England and the Catholic Church. So then comes another important development, that is the Catholic Reformation. So at first, Pope viewed the rapid success of Protestant revolution with indifference. That is, popes didn't know what to do. There were parts of Europe getting disconnected or cutting off their relations with the church, but the Pope was clueless as in what to do. But when the half of European countries such as Germany, England, Scandinavia, Scotland and Switzerland had been won over by the Protestants, the Roman Catholic Church tried to set its house in order. So now the church decided that if they aren't doing anything, all parts of Europe will cut off their connections with the church, and it was time to deal with the problems the church was facing and to keep its house in order. That is, to come out of this corruption and to address the problems in a proper way. So it undertook a successful program of removing abuses and useless rituals. See, very important development is now the church is having a self-correction or trying to correct itself by removing all the useless rituals and ceremonies. And this program is known as Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation. This is called Counter-Reformation. That is, the church is reforming itself at the face of the criticisms which were raised by reformers like Luther and Calvin. It was indeed a remarkable achievement of the Catholic Church that it recovered much of its lost position and succeeded in retaining the loyalty of half of Europe. So somehow, because of these efforts, the church was able to correct itself to a large extent and recover its lost position in Europe by the post-16th century and retain the loyalty of half of Europe. And after this, not many parts of Europe cut off their connections with the church. Instead, they decided to keep the relations with the church, that is the Catholic Church, active. So some of the questions are, why was Christianity divided into Protestantism and Roman Catholic Church? So we already saw in 1517, Martin Luther for the first time criticizes church for all their ceremonies and corrupt practices. And later these developments get spread to other parts of Europe like Switzerland, where Calvin takes up this process, and then how in France also we see there is a criticism against meaningless customs and rituals of the Catholic Church, and how in England under Henry VIII there is a personal fight between the king and the pope, and that leads to the cut-off of the relationship between the church and the king. And these are the developments which lead to a Protestant revolution in the 16th century. And what were the causes of conflict within Christianity? Why the Christians were split into two sects? So this is an essay type question. So in the two sects, you will have to say the major two sects were Protestants and the Catholics. And Protestants were the ones who protested against the wrong measures and the corruption which was prevalent in the Catholic Church during the period of Renaissance. And figures like Martin Luther and Calvin were important in spreading the teachings which helped man understand that we don't need the section called priest to connect to God. Instead, man can do it by himself. The knowledge of the Bible will help human beings or man connect to the God in proper ways, and there was no need of a priest who was corrupt and who led a very wrong life. And so Catholics, as a result of all these developments, by the 17th century, we see that they start the counter-reformation to bring the house back into order. So, because of it being an essay type question, you will have to begin by the 16th century, where the Catholic Church had reached and what its state was, and what led to people like Luther and Calvin to question these measures of the Catholic Church, leading to formations of new churches which were called the Protestant churches, and how the Catholic Church responded to these developments. So now we come to the last topic in this chapter, that is historians' views on the validity of the notion European Renaissance. So historians have been discussing or debating over whether this period can really be called a period of rebirth or revival. To what extent can it be called a Renaissance? So the question arises, can the period of Renaissance be marked as a sharp break with the past and the rebirth of ideas from Greek and Roman cultures, when the earlier period, that is 12th and 13th century, is called period of darkness? So the most important question is, commonly or generally what we see is 14th to 17th centuries are called the period of Renaissance, and the period just before that, that is the period between 5th to 13th century, are called the Dark Age, or a period where nothing important happened. Everything was declining. There was this feudal structure. There was no individual freedom. There was the high-handedness of church. And it's in 14th century that people come back to life. That is, they reawaken by going back to the classical period. So the question then historians ask is, was it really so? Was it really that there was nothing happening in this period between 5th and 13th century? So we see that writers like Peter Burke of England, who is an historian of the 19th century, hold that a writer, Burckhardt, had exaggerated the sharp differences between earlier period and the Renaissance period. See, now historians say Peter Burke is, when he looks at this period of Renaissance, he says that it was the work of historian Burckhardt who exaggerated, that is, made big the difference between earlier period and the Renaissance period. Whatever it is not that there was no difference, but Burckhardt exaggerated or made big whatever small differences there was there between the earlier period and the Renaissance period. It implies that the Greek and Roman civilizations took new birth in the Renaissance period, and the scholars and artists of the period substituted the pre-Christian world for the Christian world. So for people who term this period as the Dark Age, for them the Christian world was replaced by the pre-Christian world. So as simple as that, people are going back to old classical structures and the old traditions are brought back to the present. But these arguments are exaggerated. Again, scholars like Peter Berg say that it is not as simple as that. It is not just like simply going back to the past and bringing those traditions back to the present, but something more is happening. In fact, scholars in the 12th and 13th centuries had been familiar with Greek and Roman cultures and traditions and continued to be very important part of people's life. See, this is very important, that in the period between 12th and 13th century also, scholars are trying to be aware of the ancient Greek structures or Roman cultures. So their contribution cannot be forgotten. It is not that one fine morning in the 14th century, people are waking up and going back to the past. But the seeds of it is sown much before that. Even in the 12th and 13th century also, people who were thinking and trying hard to improve their ways of living were making efforts to know more about the ancient cultures. So this is one of the causes. We have also studied it as one of the factors leading to Renaissance. So the developments in the 12th and 13th century cannot be forgotten. And the scholars were trying to understand the Greek and Roman cultures even in the 12th and 13th century. It did not start all of a sudden in the 14th century. To hold that Renaissance was a period of dynamism and artistic creativity, and Middle Ages was a time of darkness and gloom is oversimplification. So this word oversimplification is very important, because when you say or when you label these time periods, one as Dark Age and the other as Rebirth, you forget the complexities or the complex developments happening in all these periods. So as students of history, it is important that you do not label this period in a simplified manner. Instead, it is important to see the continuity and change in a proper way. Many elements associated with Renaissance movement in Italy can be traced back to the 12th and 13th century. This is exactly here what we have seen. The developments in the 12th and 13th century is getting continued in the 14th century. And some historians hold that in the 9th century France, similar literary and artistic activities had been thriving. Another important point which is raised is, even in the 9th century France also, we could see similar literary activities thriving or having its place. So then how can we say that this is completely a dark age where nothing crucial happened? So historians like Peter Berg clearly questions this notion of medieval period being a dark age. And it says that it is scholars like Burckhardt who is exaggerating the difference between the medieval period and the period of Renaissance. So as students of history, we must be very careful while we label or use these terms to understand this period in history. And we also see that, in fact, the cultural changes in Renaissance time in Europe were not shaped only by classical civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome. So it is not just going back to ancient Greek and Roman civilizations and bringing it here, but archaeological and artistic recovery of Roman culture did produce great admiration and civilization. It is not to deny the contributions of the great classical traditions in Renaissance, but we must not forget that European Renaissance not only learned from Greeks and Romans, but also from India, Arabia, Iran, Central Asia, and China. So this is important. We already saw the contributions of Arabs in the field of science. This is a topic in the chapter. So likewise, similar to the Greeks and Romans, there are contributions made by people of Arabia, Iran, Central Asia, and China to the developments happening in Renaissance Europe. But the problem is that the early European writers saw the Renaissance from a European-centric viewpoint. So here lies the major problem, that when you see all of these developments in a Europe-centric view, with only your concern of what is happening in Europe, you forget other contributions which the Arabs are making, which the Indians are making, which the Iranians are making in the field of science and other developments, which help the Europeans improve this knowledge in the period of Renaissance. So in the period of Renaissance, we also see an important development taking place, that is the coming up of the public and private sphere. So what it is. So, but some important changes did happen in this period. Gradually, the public and private sphere of life began to become separate. So there is a separation of the public and private, which comes as an important development of this period. The public sector meant government and formal religion, and the private sector, on the other hand, meant family and personal religion. So the public sector dealt with whatever was there which concerned with the governmental activities and formal religion, and the private sector dealt with family and personal religion of the individual. And in the Renaissance period, the separation between these two spheres become clear, which was not this clear in the period before the Renaissance. The individual had both private as well as public role, and he was not only a member of one of the three orders, he was also a person in his own right. See, the major development in the Renaissance period is the rediscovery of the individual. Till this time, individual is not there in the center. So when the individual gets rediscovered, he has an additional quality of being somebody with a set of rights of his own and a thinking power and a decision making power, which before then was denied to him. Before the Renaissance period, you are an individual just belonging to one of the three orders, that is the clergy, the nobility, or the peasantry, or the serfs. So this was it. That was your only identity. But by the 14th century, very clearly, the identity of man becomes one of an individual too. This idea of individual arises as the most important identity of a man in this period. So that's how the separation of the public and private sphere takes place. And this is an important development or the consequence of the developments happening in the Renaissance period. And along with this, different regions of Europe tried to establish their separate identities based on language in this period. So until then, all of the European countries were under some or the other big empire. They didn't have an identity of their language or belonging to a nation of their own. But from the 14th century onwards, different regions of Europe which were under great empires starts establishing themselves along with a separate identity which was based on the kind of language they spoke. And Europe, earlier united by the Roman Empire and later by Latin and Christianity, so it was under the Roman Empire, the whole of Europe had come together for the first time, because all these territories were invaded and came under the control of the Roman Empire. And later, when it converted to Christianity, it was Christianity which held the whole Europe together, now divided into states. So now with the new identities coming up majorly on the basis of language, we see that there was a disintegration and division of this Europe into different nation states, which was united by a common language. So new identities emerged, and the idea of this united European culture gets dissolved with the coming of new states with a common language as their identity. So the question on this topic is, discuss whether there was European Renaissance in the 14th century. So here this is again an essay type question. You will have to describe the historian's views on it. How scholars and historians question this idea of Renaissance as going back to the Greek and Roman civilization and replanting or bringing it to the 14th century. And how scholars like Peter Burke question this and say that it was Burckhardt, the scholar, who exaggerated the difference between the medieval time period and the Renaissance, and how scholars have forgotten that other parts of the world like the Arabians, the Indians, Iranians have also contributed to the scientific and the literary knowledge, and how even in Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries there were efforts by scholars to know more about the ancient Greek civilization. And in 9th century France, it is said that there was a literary thriving of literary studies and other things. So all these things are to be taken into consideration, and this idea of European Renaissance is to be studied critically. So here with this last question on the question of European Renaissance, we can end this section. So here, as we know, we have looked at the changing cultural traditions, and the focus was on Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries. So we saw how this period is called the period of Renaissance, which literally meant rebirth or revival, and how in this period two major things are happening, that is going back to the intellectual and literary traditions of classical Rome and Greece, and how there is a revival of the artistic traditions. So the intellectual activities and going back to the literary traditions came to be called the humanism, the movement of humanism, which meant the study of culture of the ancient past. So these developments we saw closely, and then the literary traditions, who all were the scholars who were playing a major role, who were giving their contributions in helping man discover himself and the world. And then when it came to architecture, artists, art, painting and sculptures in different parts of Europe, what all developments were happening there too. And from there we came to the developments happening in the sphere where women were located. Was women included in this Renaissance? What was the role played by women? What its limitations were? And then finally we looked at the term Renaissance and in which ways can we use it? What are the problems there when we call the medieval period a dark age and Renaissance a rebirth? So with this, I hope you have had a good time getting to know more about the Europe between 14th and 17th centuries.